Hello, and welcome to, again, our consideration of the upcoming readings for the second Sunday of the Lenten period, or second weekend of the Lenten period. The first reading comes from the opening book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, chapter 15, verses 5 through 12, and then verses 17 through 18. The second reading is from Paul's letter to the Philippians, chapter 3, verses 17 through chapter 4, verses 1. And the gospel is taken from that according to Luke, chapter 9, verses 28b through 36. Now, on the second Sunday of Lent, traditionally in more recent times, we look at an episode that occurs in Jesus' life, which is known as the Transfiguration. Now, a little bit of background to see where this fits into the larger story of Jesus that we are following during the Lenten season. There is speculation that, remember, that Jesus had just finished 8 days before, coming from the area called Caesarea Philippi, his disciples that not only when he asked the question, who did they say he was, that Peter had answered the Messiah of God. And then it began to say that the Son of Man, we're going up to Jerusalem, will be betrayed, crucified, and rise from the dead. This is an important section in Luke's Gospel, by the way, which is known as the journey section. It is the largest part of the Lucan Gospel, and over the course of the year we will be looking at sections of it, but it continually reflects that Jesus is moving from the ministry that he'd been doing in the Galilee down to Judea and to Jerusalem, and of course, which is a characteristic certainly of Luke, it will be in Jerusalem that the final days both of Jesus' life, but also that the resurrection will take place. So Luke mentions that it was 8 days later that this event on the mountain took place. Now, exactly what the mountain is, again, is a discussion that has gone on, but for a number of centuries, shortly after the actual time of Jesus, it was believed that the mountain they went up was called Tabor. It is not the highest mountain in Israel. The highest mountain in Israel is Mount Hermon, which sits to the very north of Israel, and indeed is extreme. It would probably fit our categories of mountains. In fact, even in the midst of summer, there is still evidence of snow on top of Mount Hermon. But the likelihood that Jesus would have climbed up that high a mountain with 3 of his disciples is not too much the case. So, Mount Tabor, which today is the place where we remember the advent of the Transfiguration. If you visit in the Holy Land, if you visit Israel and go up to Mount Tabor, you take a circuitous route which winds like this. In order to get up on it, you have to take a taxi cab ride, and the taxi cab drivers drive like, well, I was going to say a bat out of hell, but they drive very quickly, and it's an experience in and of itself. That's just an aside. The next time you visit Israel to make the trip to Tabor. Now, why is 8 days mentioned? Well, Luke perhaps is not just counting, but the eighth day, by the way, in the thinking of the New Testament, would be a new day. See, there are 7 days of the week. You can't add another day, so simply they would call it the 8th day. That's one of the thoughts as to why Luke mentions that, because the 8th day is the first day of something new. And in this case, certainly in seeing Jesus as he will be seen in a new light on Tabor, is a new beginning. So all of that, again, is kind of background as we're looking really in these discussions at some of the background to the New Testament material that is remembered, in this case, by Luke. Now, Peter, you remember, had declared that Jesus was the Messiah of God. And so now, on top of this hill or mountain, Jesus is seen in a new light. And so that's interesting, that not only is he visually, that is, his face seems to be seen in a new way, but also his whole figure is transformed into what we would call a glorified state. Now, what exactly is a glorified state? Well, to see something in a different way. And so all the characteristics of what we would call a theophany, an appearance of God, are found in this description. Namely, you have cloud, you have light, you have voices, and you have the mountain. Mountain, as you remember, whenever anyone goes up a mountain, is pretty much an indication that one will encounter the divine. So that all is background here to this particular episode. When they are there and Jesus goes up this mountain to pray, again, as we've mentioned a number of times, prayer is always a characteristic in Luke's story. Before something significant is going to happen, Jesus prays. So here you can see how that works out here. We don't know exactly, as I said, what the change in Jesus looks like. The writing describes his clothes as dazzling white. Well, I know what white is. You can figure out what dazzling means, okay? But apparently it's white in a way that was truly unique. And looks as if this light encompassed, as I mentioned, the whole of Jesus' person. Now, what is unique to this gospel, this episode, as you may know, is also found in Mark and Matthew, and they tell it in very similar ways. So in that regard, some of the material that we've looked at earlier on, last year with Mark would be probably also true here. But what is interesting is that in this gospel, the two figures who appear with Jesus, he engages, there's a discussion, and this is what's important and unique here, is that the discussion that takes place between Moses, Elijah, and Jesus is actually recorded by Luke, who, by the way, pictures the disciples as sleeping through this. So there's two parts to this episode. The part where the disciples are sleeping, and then the part where Peter and the other two, James and John, are awake. And again, the James and John, there's three famous ones who always seem to go with Jesus on unique occasions. So what are they talking about between Moses and Elijah and Jesus? About his exodus, about his departure. The word departure is used. Now, what exactly is the departure that they're talking about? Well, there are a couple of ways in which that could be looked at. One could recall the first exodus, the first departure, which could, going to the Hebrew Bible, the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt into and on the journey to the Promised Land. So that could certainly be an exodus or a departure. It could even have gone all the way back to the garden story where Eve and Adam, the first man and woman, are pictured as departing from the garden into the real world. And that, of course, is an important story to look at. But so is that what the reference is, that Jesus will be really going into the real world, which he already is in, but maybe that's some aspect. The departure or the exodus could certainly be a euphemism for death, and therefore be an indication that Jesus, when he comes to Jerusalem, will suffer and die. Is that what the departure is that they're talking about? Or could the departure be an event that happens after the resurrection? Because it's only in Luke's story that the episodes about Jesus ascending into heaven takes place. So is that the departure that they're looking at? So you see, this exodus or this departure has other interpretations as we look at it. I might suggest that it perhaps is the second, that it's Jesus' departure through suffering and death from this world, that maybe really is the purpose of this episode being brought into the gospel at this point, after Jesus had already narrated to his disciples, remember, that he was going to Jerusalem where he would suffer, die, and be raised. So all of that might be ways of interpreting this. It is, of course, the salvific mission of God's Messiah that he will indeed suffer, die, and be raised. So, and therefore will be seen in glory. Some would say, therefore, that this picture of the transfiguration of Jesus actually was a resurrection story. In other words, it more fits at the end of Jesus' story than at this point. But for various reasons, it has been transferred into this particular point, maybe as a message of hope, particularly as we look at the three disciples who are involved here, that although Jesus will suffer and die, there is also an important meaning to his death, and it will result in something very different than they had expected. So all of that is a little bit of background. Of course, Moses and Elijah, we've talked about them before. Moses is generally figured as representing the law of the Lord, and Elijah, of course, is the classic example of a prophet. It is also true that both of them were mysteriously taken up into heaven. When Moses dies, no one knows where he is buried, and all of that remains kind of a mystery. And Elijah, of course, goes up into heaven in the fiery chariot, only to return. So those reasons why they are here. Now at this point, Peter and the two others wake up. Okay, remember I said they were sleeping? So for the first half of this, that they really know what's happening, we don't know. And obviously, suddenly, seeing Jesus in the transfigured way, Peter says, maybe, look, Lord, let's put 3 tents here. Oh, one for you, Elijah, one for you, Moses, and one for you, Jesus. Now, why would he want 3 tents? Well, perhaps because he wanted to capture this event that he has now been witness to. And by building 3 tents, some say that the idea of tents reminds one of the Jewish feast. You remember there are 3 major Jewish feasts in Judaism, one of them in the fall of the year, which was known as the Feast of the Tabernacles, or Sukkoth, or the Feast of Tents. So is there some reference to that that Luke has in mind with these words of Jesus, or that Peter has in mind? The danger here is that by building 3 tents, one for each of them, they are reducing Jesus to the level of Moses and Elijah. And as wonderful as they both were and are in the history of Israel and of our history, nevertheless, that would not be something that would want to be done. So in that sense, God now intervenes and corrects that thought. Says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen." So once again, what we would call a theophany. God speaks out of a cloud. And clouds tend, by the way, to surround mountains in these stories, which leads us to wonder again where the mountain is, although we will look later that mountains are important, as I mentioned a few times, for encountering God. Now, there is an interesting contrast here between Moses and Jesus. And why do I mention this? Because in the stories, when Moses climbs a mountain to receive the tablets of the law, and when he comes down after encountering the law, Moses' face shone from having been present in God's presence. His face was so enlightened that people couldn't stand to look at him. Not that they couldn't stand, but it was so powerful that he, at one point later on, when he encounters God, they tell him that he needs to wear a mask over his face just so that they can look at him. I know masks in these times perhaps are a little more relevant than we had thought back when we first read some of these things. So in that experience, it's Moses' face. Here it's the whole person of Jesus that is seen in a new light. The Israelites were afraid of Moses. I just mentioned this because when they saw his face, and in a certain way, so are Peter, James, and John when they see Jesus in this new way. Moses is caught up in receiving the commandments from God, and Jesus commands his 3 disciples to listen. So there is, what I'm pointing out here is some contrast between the experience of Jesus and the experience of Moses. Again, how often does the gospel writer Luke refer back to understandings of Hebrew tradition, Israel's tradition, that the reader, even though it would be basically, as we mentioned often, more of a Gentile tradition, still be very familiar with those kind of events. So all of that concludes, and Jesus is pictured as telling the disciples, now don't tell anyone about this, but again, you know what that means, tell someone not to do something like talking. What is the most often reflection or response to that, all right? So, this is my son, my chosen, listen to him, is the message that once again we hear being given. Thank goodness the disciples woke up. It's interesting that they tend to sleep at interesting times in the scripture. Now that's another whole kind of thought, but I just mentioned that here. That comes to the first reading today. The first readings, as I mentioned last week, are important episodes from the story of Israel. And this is the occasion when God makes with Abraham, in this part of the scripture, he's still called Abram. By the way, you might notice that it's only later on God really gives Abram a fuller name or a new name, and he's known as Abraham. So we mentioned Abraham, but just that if you're carefully listening, you'll say, I heard them read Abram. Did they miss something? No, that's what the text at this point would say. God says to this man, Abram, I make to you 2 promises. I promise that you will have an heir and will be the father of a great people, of a great nation. And secondly, that I will give you a land. Now it is true that the whole story found in the Pentateuch in the books of Moses, are that though carrying how that promise is ultimately carried out. Well, you can see Abraham, you do like this guy. He says, that's nice, Lord, but how about a little sign that this is going to happen? One finds in the scripture very frequently, famous people even ask for a sign. Not that they doubt, but that they really wonder that something like this could possibly truly happen. So God now will enter into, with Abraham, a covenant. Now, covenants are very important agreements. I think we may mention this before, but just to reiterate how covenant ideas work. Covenants are often made, a couple characteristics. One, a covenant is agreement made between a powerful force and a less powerful force. So it could be a powerful nation or a less powerful nation. It could be a powerful person or a less powerful person. Or in this case, obviously God stands on the side of the powerful, and Israel will stand on the side of the less important. In this case, God and Abraham. This is a covenant, not the first covenant found in the scripture. The first covenant is made by God with Noah after the flood, going back to the book of Genesis. But in terms of the Israelite nation, this is the first covenant. And so it is made with Abraham. Now, how is it? It lacks, as I started to say, there are different aspects of covenant. Once the terms of the covenant are made, it is the powerful side that makes the terms. The other side must agree to it. And it isn't that this side can negotiate with the maker of the covenant, but there must be an agreement, because covenants do not work unless both parties agree to it. And of course, the final characteristic of the covenant pattern is that once a covenant is entered into and made, it can never be broken. Even though one or the other parties may not live up to the terms of it, nevertheless, the covenant remains. And so that is one of the more interesting characteristics of covenants. All right, so what is the covenant that God makes with Abraham? Well, here's what makes it very different. It's known, by the way, as the cutting covenant, because God says to Abraham, take a number of different animals and slice them or cut them in half, laying one part on this side, one part on the other side. You can do this to all the animals, not to birds. Apparently birds they couldn't catch, or they didn't want to do that. Now I know this is maybe, well, really, but remember, in the ancient world, sacrifices to God were very often animals. That is, sheep, goats, or other kinds of animals. And so this was simply not only a part of the tradition that Israel belonged to, but it was also a part of the other nations that we know around the Middle East, that covenants or agreements or sacrifices were animals made to the divines, to the divinities, goddesses or goddess, in this case also made to the Lord. So you get Abraham lists, kind of lining up these different animals. And now comes a dramatic action in which Abraham is kind of, a darkness takes over, is the way in which it's described in the scripture. Much like, and I think that might be one of the reasons why this story is appropriate to this time, that remember the boys, Peter, James, and John were sleeping. So Abraham is cast into this darkness or to a sleep, perhaps reminiscent also back to the book of Genesis, when God, having created the first man, looks to create the suitable partner for the man, casts him into a deep sleep, and of course from that creates a woman. So all of that imagery seems to be at work, and it's important to notice in the scripture how often imagery works to kind of communicate, give understanding of things that are happening. Now on the part of the Lord, passes through, you can see now we got those animals split, passes through the midst of them. in a fiery way. And again, fire is very much a part of the presence of God. And the covenant is made. Now, this is an interesting kind of covenant because Abram is not really asked to do anything. Remember I said that there are two parts. The agreement is made by the one side, and the agreement to carry it out is by the other side. Abram is not asked to do anything here. God is pictured as making this agreement with this man and with his descendants. So in that sense, this covenant, the Abraham covenant or the cutting covenant, is unique in the scriptures. And it's very dramatic. You certainly got to see how this would make a good Hollywood scene, right? Fire, light, sound, darkness, all of the things that happen in this episode. And again, this story happens in the book of Genesis. By the way, the Abraham stories are part of the Genesis tradition. So this book, as we've mentioned a couple of times, is important for giving a lot of kind of background to the developing tradition of Judaism and later to our own developing of our beliefs. Now, where exactly was this event taking place that we described? I think this is interesting. We're not sure. Abraham, remember, in last week's reading was known, I was a wandering Armenian, and that Armenian, by the way, I think we mentioned, is none other than Abraham, okay? So why exactly the text describes him that way, I'm not sure, but it does. What is the promise about the land, okay? And it's interesting, if one took it literally, I'm not sure that they did, the land promised by God to Abraham goes all the way from Egypt to Mesopotamia. It's an extravagant territory of land that is promised here, called sometimes the land of the Canaanites, but I think we've also noticed that there were many other tribes who settled there, and also pointed out why this strip of land, where Abraham will, by the way, later settle. He will get there, and then time will move on, because it's a link between the Nile tradition, which is Egypt, and the Euphrates tradition, which is called Mesopotamia. So this is the promise that God makes to Abraham. See, and that's why, as I'm mentioning here, not a unique covenant or is a unique covenant in the sense that it's one-sided. All Abraham has to do is kind of hang out, remember, and it will take him a while to get an heir, Isaac, Ishmael, and the land finally will be Israel's when Joshua later leads the Israelites across the Jordan. So all of that is this second week of the Lenten time. New beginnings. Again, it would be a new beginning for Abraham. A new beginning brought about by the death and resurrection of Jesus. And perhaps as we come together this week, let's not take too literally the words, tell no one of this event, but maybe we tell the story of this transfiguring, transforming of Jesus, not so much his person, but with his grace and his strength, transforms those who accept his teaching. So we're very grateful once again for the opportunity to use these Lenten days as times of renewal. May the Lord brighten us this day and all of these days. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.